Chapter 1. The letter from Scotland was in the second week of October, during one of those gray and brooding stretches of weather that descends like a damp veil over London, that I found Sherlock Holmes in a state of most intense abstraction. The fire burned low in our Baker Street sitting room, casting flickering shadows upon the walls, while outside a steady drizzle tapped at the windows like a melancholic metronome. Holmes, cross-legged upon the settee, was utterly immersed in contemplation, his long, pale fingers steepled before him, his sharp eyes fixed upon the hearth, as if expecting it to deliver revelations. The case of the Camberwell poisoner had just concluded, and I confess I looked forward to a quiet week with my friend, unencumbered by threats of arsenic and letters written in invisible ink. Yet such calm was rarely permitted for long in Holmes's presence. A man such as he, to whom action was life's very oxygen, could no more remain idle than a racehorse in a stable. I wonder, Holmes mused suddenly, startling me from the morning paper, how many people realize how often truth is wrapped in coincidence, and how frequently the mind rejects that coincidence for being too convenient. I dare say very few, I replied, folding the paper with a smile. Though you, Holmes, seem to dine on such peculiarities. He nodded without turning. Peculiarities are the footprints of the improbable, and where improbability lingers, deduction may yet thrive. Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Hudson, bearing a silver tray upon which rested a single envelope. She handed it to Holmes and withdrew. I noticed at once that the envelope bore a Scottish postmark, and was addressed to Holmes in a spidery, almost trembling hand. Holmes sliced it open with his pocket knife, and extracted a folded letter, which he read silently. As he progressed, I observed his brow rise incrementally, and the thin line of his mouth curve into something between interest and disquiet. He passed it to me wordlessly. The letter read, October 9th, Rideau House, Canongate, Edinburgh, Scotland, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, 221B Baker Street. London, dear sir. Forgive my sudden intrusion upon your time and attention. I am Lady Evelyn Dunrose of Rideau House in Edinburgh, and I write to you in deepest desperation and confusion. 4 nights past, my husband, Lord Archibald Dunrose, was found dead in the study of our ancestral home, locked from the inside. His body was discovered at dawn by our footman. The cause of death, according to the attending physician, was a sharp trauma to the chest, what appeared to be a dagger wound, yet no weapon was found in the room. The door had been bolted, the windows latched, the fireplace undisturbed. No signs of entry or exit have been discovered. The police have dismissed it as a suicide, but I assure you, Mr. Holmes, my husband was no more likely to take his own life than he was to sprout wings and fly. There are other oddities I cannot explain in this letter. My family urges discretion, but I am more concerned with truth than reputation. I have enclosed funds for travel and lodgings, should you consent to take up the matter. I beg of you come to Edinburgh at once. Yours in hope, Lady Evelyn Dunrose. Well, Watson, Holmes said, rubbing his hands together briskly, it appears the quiet week you anticipated must be postponed. We have been summoned to the Scottish capital under the shadow of a locked room mystery. Quite invigorating, wouldn't you agree? I nodded, my curiosity thoroughly piqued. Indeed. A locked study, no weapon, a fatal wound, and a noble family steeped in secrecy. It sounds almost like the prelude to a Gothic novel, which is precisely why I do not trust it, Holmes replied. There is always method behind melodrama. The trick lies in discovering which of its many layers is true. He rose swiftly, already donning his traveling cloak. Pack light, Watson. The next train for Edinburgh departs in an hour and 30 minutes. I believe we shall find the answers, not in the dagger, but in the silence that followed its plunge. We arrived in Edinburgh the following day, under a grim and overcast sky. The ancient city seemed to rise from the mist like a stone giant, its silhouette jagged with chimneys and Gothic spires. As we passed the looming towers of St. Giles and the steep alleys of the old town, Holmes leaned slightly out the carriage window. A city of secrets, he murmured. Streets within streets. A perfect breeding ground for deception. Rideau House stood on a modest rise near Canongate, just east of Holyrood Palace. It was not a grand estate by English standards, but its ivy-covered stone facade and high, mullioned windows gave it a brooding, ancestral air. We were received by a stiff-faced butler who led us through echoing halls to a wood-paneled drawing-room where Lady Evelyn awaited us. Dot, she was a woman of perhaps 40 years, with deep auburn hair pinned tightly, and a bearing that suggested both nobility and weariness. Her eyes were large and rimmed with fatigue, but she stood to greet us with grace. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for coming so swiftly. Holmes bowed. Lady Dunrose, your letter intrigued me. I trust the local constabulary have not obstructed. Your wish for further inquiry? They are skeptical, she said carefully. They see no reason to doubt the verdict. But I assure you Archibald would not have ended his life, not in such a manner. There is something terribly wrong here. Then let us waste no time. If it pleases you, Lady Dunrose, I would like to see the study at once. She hesitated. Of course, though I must warn you the room has remained untouched since that night. I insisted. I felt somehow it would speak if left as it was. Holmes's eyes gleamed. An excellent instinct, Lady Dunrose. Often the dead speak loudest in silence. As she led us from the drawing-room, I could not help but sense the weight of the house pressing inward, the walls thick with memory, and each step up the stair echoing like a heartbeat. Somewhere ahead, a study lay locked, and within it, a man had died without explanation. Dot. And in that quiet Scottish house, Sherlock Holmes prepared to ask the first question of many. Chapter 2. The Man from Calton Hill. It was not often that Sherlock Holmes appeared contemplative after receiving a case, yet as our cab clattered through the cobbled streets of Edinburgh toward Calton Hill, he remained uncharacteristically silent, his sharp eyes gazing through the rain-speckled window. The morning mist was beginning to lift, revealing a city of chimneys and church spires. Their outlines, softened by drizzle and soot, dot the summons from Inspector. MacAndrews of the Edinburgh Constabulary had arrived with unusual urgency. The case, according to his brief telegram, concerned the disappearance of a prominent antiquarian, Professor Archibald Forsyth, under suspicious and possibly violent circumstances. The professor had last been seen in the vicinity of his study atop Calton Hill, and the authorities had hesitated to call it a crime until the morning brought blood on the doorstep and a shattered window. A vanished man. Watson, Holmes said at last, tapping the cab wall with his cane, but one who left blood behind. That in itself is a contradiction worth our attention. You think it's staged? I think it points to a cleverer mind at play than first assumed. Vanishings, my dear fellow, are easy enough when no one is looking. But a man like Professor Forsyth, a creature of habit, routine, and social duty, something's amiss. We arrived at the base of Calton Hill, where a cluster of police officers stood beneath black umbrellas. The imposing figure of Inspector McAndrews, a broad-shouldered Scot with a walrus mustache and eyes like slate, stepped forward as Holmes and I alighted. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for coming with such haste," he said, his accent clipped but rich with Highland burr. "You said there had been signs of violence?" Holmes prompted without delay. McAndrews gestured toward the top of the winding path. "Aye, blood on the front step of the professor's house. Not much, mind you, but fresh yesterday. The door was ajar when his housekeeper arrived this morning. The interior was disturbed, papers scattered, one cabinet overturned, and the man himself gone, vanished. Did anyone witness him leaving?" I asked. "Not a soul. The housekeeper, Mrs. MacCrae, last saw him the evening before. He had tea at 7, then retired to his study with a volume of medieval manuscripts. He often worked late into the night. The lamp was still burning when she left at 10. Holmes nodded. "And what of the manuscripts?" McAndrews furrowed his brow. "Still there, far as we can tell, though the professor's notes are missing. And this may interest you, Mr. Holmes, so is a small bronze artifact he had just acquired. Came from the excavation at Cramond, near the coast. Roman origin, they say." Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly at the mention of antiquities. "Ah, the Romans again. They do have a habit of leaving troublesome relics behind." We climbed the path to the old stone house that sat solemnly on the ridge, its windows staring blankly across the city like tired eyes. The study, a high-ceilinged room lined with dusty tomes and yellowed maps, bore the signs of a hasty intrusion, chairs tipped over, an ink bottle smashed upon the hearth, and fragments of glass near the shattered window. Holmes moved through the room with the delicacy of a dancer, his eyes drinking in every detail. He paused before the desk and lifted a half-written letter, still blotchy with drying ink. He read it aloud. "To Professor Langley, my dear Robert. The artifact arrived this morning. It is beyond my expectations. The markings suggest a Celtic overlay upon Roman form, something I've not seen in my entire career. I suspect it may be connected to the altar stones in the Dean village cave, though I dare not commit this to writ until—" The note ended abruptly. A clue interrupted. Holmes murmured "Dot." He then stooped to examine the footprints beneath the window. The stone floor bore a single scuff of earth remarkable, given the cleanliness of the rest of the room. Holmes produced his lens and crouched. Size 9, left foot, heavy heel, square tread, working man's boot. Not Forsyth. Watson, note the direction of the splatter. I leaned in. The small crimson blot on the floor angled toward the doorway. So he was already wounded before leaving or being taken. Just so, but it's not enough blood to suggest a fatal wound. A nick, perhaps, enough to confuse, not to kill. Holmes rose and strode to the tall glass cabinet against the wall, now partly ajar. The shelves were lined with ancient scrolls. A small bust of Caesar and a labeled spot, conspicuously empty. "Here's where the missing artifact sat," he said. Note the dust patterned something round, perhaps palm-sized, removed without care. Inspector McAndrews, who had been observing quietly, spoke again. You received it only 2 days ago via courier from a dig near Cramond. I've spoken to the dig leader, one Miss Elspeth Doyle. She confirmed its authenticity, but seemed uneasy when asked about its removal. Uneasy? Holmes turned toward him. She said oddly that it shouldn't have been moved. At that, Holmes's expression darkened slightly. Superstition? More like fear. Holmes tapped the side of his nose. Curious indeed. We shall call upon this Miss Doyle. Before we left, Holmes took one final look about the study. He paused beside a tall grandfather clock, placing a hand against its mahogany surface. The professor kept to a strict schedule, yet last night he broke routine. Why? And why leave behind his precious library, his letters, his tea, untouched save for one relic? He turned to us, eyes narrowing. This was no ordinary burglary. This, my friends, is theater. Staged? I asked. Holmes nodded. And? Well played. As we exited into the drizzle, I could not help but glance back at the silent house, its windows glimmering faintly through the mist. A man had vanished, leaving no scream, no witness, and barely a trace. And yet already Holmes was drawing a map of shadows from the smallest of signs dot as we rode through the damp streets toward the university. Holmes leaned toward me. Watson, he said, we are not searching for a criminal alone. We are chasing a mind that believes it can outpace deduction. That I find irresistible. Chapter. A glimpse through the fog. It was a chill, gray morning in Edinburgh when Holmes and I set out on foot from the Caledonian Hotel, our boots echoing across the cobbled streets still wet from the previous night's rain. The city had awakened, but only in part. Hawkers shouted faintly from distant alleys. Carriages rattled along Princess Street, and the occasional figure in a dark coat hurried past, shoulders hunched against the cold. A veil of mist clung stubbornly to the rooftops, blurring the silhouette of the distant castle. Holmes walked briskly, hands clasped behind his back, the collar of his Inverness cape turned up against the morning wind. I followed close behind, still digesting the oddities of the previous day, the mysterious letter that summoned Miss Frances McAllister back to Edinburgh, the sudden death of Lord Merton in his study, and the silent but watchful presence of Miss Eliza Carroway, the housekeeper with secrets in her eyes. The geometry of this case is intriguing, Watson, Holmes remarked suddenly. A sealed room, a locked drawer, and a man dead with no mark upon his body, save for the faint bruising around the throat. Yet no sign of struggle, no scream heard. Curious, is it not? Indeed, I replied. Lestrade's theory still rests on the presence of that letter opener, though it bears no blood or prints. He seems convinced it was a crime of passion. Holmes made a dismissive gesture. Lestrade is chasing shadows. A passion crime requires heat, Watson impulse, emotion. But this was calculated. Cold, very cold. We soon arrived at Merton House, its facade even more grim under the dim light. A constable at the front gave us a nod and admitted us without question. Inside, the same somber hush lingered in the air as before. The scent of pipe smoke, once Lord Merton's signature, aroma, now mingled faintly with furniture polish and something else, something I could not place at first. It was Holmes who identified it. Camphor, he said, lifting his head. Used liberally in storage trunks and drawers. Possibly introduced recently to mask another odor. We ascended the stairs to the late lord's study. The room had been left untouched since our last visit. A velvet rope, courtesy of Scotland Yard, cordoned off the scene. Lestrade was already there, leaning against the window frame and sipping tea from a chipped porcelain cup. "Back again, Holmes?" He grunted. "You'll find I've had another look. No secret panels, no hidden staircases, no way in or out, unless someone grew wings." Holmes said nothing at first. He moved like a man entranced, stepping inside the study with a care that bordered on reverence. His gaze swept the bookshelves, the heavy mahogany desk, the Persian rug with its faded reds and greens. He crouched suddenly, running 2 fingers along a groove in the floor near the hearth. "Recently disturbed," he murmured. "This rug was shifted. See here dust displaced, but only slightly." Lestrade raised an eyebrow. "So what?" "Housemaid. Probably adjusted it." "Perhaps," Holmes replied. "But the question remains, why would someone move a heavy rug in a locked room and then place it back ever so slightly off-center?" I watched as Holmes turned his attention to the massive writing desk. He tried each drawer locked, save for one. It contained only a blotter, several used nibs, and a faded photograph of a woman, her face pale and formal in the style of a generation past. "His wife," Lestrade offered, "died some years back. Pneumonia, I believe." Holmes made no comment, but pocketed the photograph. He turned to the window, his eyes narrowing. "This latch," he said, pointing. "It's functional, but flawed. See the hairline crack here at the base? Someone tampered with it." Lestrade stepped forward. "You're not seriously suggesting someone climbed a 2-story wall and entered through that narrow frame?" "No," Holmes said, "but I am suggesting that someone wanted it to appear impossible." We turned as the door opened behind us. Miss Frances McAllister entered, her expression composed yet drawn, as if sleep had eluded her. She wore a simple navy dress, her dark hair pinned tightly back, and in her gloved hands she clutched a small black notebook. I thought I might find you here," she said softly. "Inspector Lestrade granted me permission to retrieve a few of my uncle's papers." Holmes greeted her with a courteous nod. "Miss McAllister, you are most welcome. May I ask, did your uncle ever mention a man named Aubrey Renfield?" Her eyes widened faintly. "Renfield? Yes, though I hadn't heard the name in years. He was once an associate of my uncle's, a solicitor, I believe. But there was a quarrel. Something to do with a missing inheritance. Uncle swore never to speak of him again." Holmes' eyes lit up for a fraction of a second. "Do you know where Mr. Renfield resides now?" She shook her head. "I assumed he'd gone abroad. Or retired." Holmes studied her for a moment longer before shifting his gaze to the notebook in her hands. "That belonged to your uncle?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. "His personal journal? It was kept in the desk. May I?" Holmes extended a hand. She hesitated, then passed it over. Holmes flipped through the pages with deft fingers, pausing at one halfway through. His brow furrowed. "Watson," he said, "look here. This passage, the key lies beneath the raven's wing. She will understand when the time comes." I frowned. "A metaphor, perhaps? Or a cipher?" Holmes said. Miss McAllister do. You know to whom this might refer? She? Francis looked suddenly uncertain. I don't know. Perhaps my aunt, but she passed when I was very young. Or Eliza, the housekeeper. She's been with the family for decades. At the mention of Eliza, Holmes turned sharply. Then I must speak with her again, Lestrade sighed. Holmes, don't tell me you suspect that woman. She's as solid as granite. Loyal, respectable. Granite can hide many veins beneath its surface, Holmes replied cryptically. We found Eliza in the drawing room, polishing silver with quiet devotion. She looked up as we entered, her eyes alert behind her spectacles. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, have you come to turn the place upside down again? Holmes gave her a slight smile. Only figuratively, madam. May I ask, did you know anything of Mr. Renfield? The silver spoon paused in her hand. I've heard the name, she said cautiously. A long time ago. There was trouble. Mr. Merton suspected he was forging documents or siphoning funds from the estate. I remember tempers flaring, but that was years past. And the phrase, the key lies beneath the raven's wing, does it mean anything to you? She blinked. The raven? She looked toward the study, her face unreadable. There's an old bronze statue in the library. A raven with wings spread. It belonged to Lady Merton. She fancied Norse mythology. Holmes' eyes gleamed. Then Watson, to the library. The library was a cavernous room lined with oak shelves and dusky tomes. Against the far wall stood a blackened bronze statue of a raven atop a pedestal. Holmes knelt beside it, examining the base. There, he whispered, a false panel. With a deft motion, he pressed on a hidden catch. The base opened with a soft click, revealing a narrow compartment. Inside lay a small velvet pouch and a folded parchment. He retrieved both, carefully laying them on a reading desk. The pouch contained a key ornate old with the initials A.R. etched into the shaft. The parchment bore a hastily written note. If anything happens to me, know that the ledger is hidden in the cellar behind the third beam. Renfield will stop at nothing. Protect Francis. Holmes stood slowly, his expression grim. The game Watson has turned. The murder of Lord Merton was no crime of passion. It was a silencing. And the motive? I asked. Greed, Holmes said. And secrets buried long ago. He turned toward the door, his pace suddenly urgent. We must find that ledger before the wrong hands do. Chapter 4. The House with the Shrouded Garden. The mist lingered in Edinburgh like a secret too stubborn to disperse. When we arrived at the edge of the Moray estate, the wrought iron gates creaked in a way that seemed too deliberate to be mere decay. Behind them loomed the late Professor Alastair Fenton's town residence, a tall Georgian structure with soot-darkened stone and curtained windows that offered no greeting. Holmes regarded the house with narrowed eyes. Observe the ivy, Watson. Unnatural growth at this time of year, yet flourishing. That suggests recent tending, does it not? I dare say the groundskeeper might simply be diligent, I ventured, but Holmes only gave a curt nod. Already lost in inspection. The constable on duty, a young, square-jawed fellow by the name of Dunstan, greeted us with a wary tip of the hat. Inspector McBride said you'd be coming. I've been keeping watch since last night. No movement. Not a soul has gone in or out. Holmes thanked him with a flick of his hand and proceeded through the gate without another word. I followed, noting as I did the stillness of the garden. It was unnerving, not merely quiet, but deathly so. No birdsong, no wind. The shrubbery had been trimmed in unusual geometric patterns, some clipped down to the root, as though someone had attempted to obliterate signs of former growth. It struck me as oddly symbolic, a purging of history. Inside the house, we were greeted by Mrs. Grimsby, the late professor's housekeeper, a pale woman with anxious eyes and hands that trembled even when at rest. She guided us through the foyer and into the drawing room. "It's not right," she muttered, wringing her apron. "Even now, with the master gone, there's a presence. I've worked for Professor Fenton these last 10 years, and never once did I feel welcome in this house." "Presence," Holmes echoed, studying her. She lowered her voice. "It was the garden, sir. He wouldn't let anyone touch it but himself, and the study never permitted anyone to clean in there. Locked it every evening. Said it was for containment of variables. Some kind of experiment, I suppose." "Where is this study?" Holmes asked sharply. "Top of the stairs, third. Door to the left." Holmes ascended immediately, taking the stairs two at a time. I lingered to offer Mrs. Grimsby a few calming words, but even as I did, I could feel the thick atmosphere of secrecy clinging to the air. The study was locked, as she had said. Holmes produced a slender set of picks from his coat and had the door open within moments. The room was small and windowless, lit only by a single gas lamp and a dusty skylight. Bookshelves lined the walls, volumes on mathematics, botany, experimental physics, and occult theory. An odd blend even for a polymath like Fenton. Holmes drifted from shelf to shelf with a surgeon's precision. "Observe this, Watson." He pointed to a collection of glass slides and copper instruments spread on a leather-topped work table. One of the glass vials still held a faint trace of dark liquid. Beside it, a tightly rolled sheet of parchment bore an inked drawing of a geometric pattern, interlocking octagons with runes sketched at each junction. "Is that ... some form of alchemical design?" I asked. Holmes's lips curled. "A cipher. Not one I've encountered before, but clearly constructed to mimic the ceremonial diagrams used in esoteric rituals. Likely nonsense, but intended to obscure a scientific principle in the guise of mysticism." He turned then to the desk drawer and forced it open. Inside lay a bundle of letters, brittle with age but tied with a fresh crimson ribbon. The topmost was addressed not to Professor Fenton, but to Madame Elira Vane, Rue de l'Ombre, Paris. Holmes scanned the letter silently. When he finished, he handed it to me. "Dearest Elira, the results grow stranger with each passing day. The frequency has stabilized, and the auditory signatures remain consistent with our earlier readings. I fear we have opened a door, one I do not yet know how to close. Should anything happen, you must find the resonance key. It is the only way to reverse the process." F. Holmes was already deep in thought. "A door, Watson. Possibly metaphorical, possibly not. And what is this resonance key? A tuning fork, a frequency, or a code?" Before I could answer, Mrs. Grimsby appeared in the doorway, clearly reluctant to cross the threshold. "There's a gentleman downstairs. Says he's from the university, Dr. Nathaniel Ormond. Came to retrieve some belongings he says belong to a research grant." Holmes's eyes glinted. "Show him up." Minutes later, Dr. Ormond entered, a gaunt, well-dressed man in his early 30s with a mouth set in permanent disdain. "I didn't expect to see the great Sherlock Holmes meddling in academia," he said with a sneer. "I came for the signal generator and resonance chart. They were part of my joint project with Professor Fenton." Holmes inclined his head. "Tell me, Dr. Ormond, what precisely was the nature of this project?" "Acoustic cognition, the study of sound waves and their effect on brain activity. We were close to something remarkable, a frequency that could influence memory, perhaps even alter perception. And was Professor Fenton's sudden death inconvenient to this research?" Ormond stiffened. "He was my mentor, yet you come scavenging his notes not 2 days after his passing. I came to preserve his legacy." Ormond snapped. "You've no idea the potential we uncovered." Holmes leaned forward, voice dangerously calm. "Then perhaps you can. Explain why your name appears nowhere in the letters addressed to Madame Vane, or why the resonance key vital to your research remains missing with no mention of its physical design." Ormond faltered. I don't know. Fenton worked in secret toward the end. He stopped sharing data. Paranoia. I assumed it was age." Holmes watched him with that eerie, still intensity he could summon at will. "You assumed wrong, Doctor? And if I'm not mistaken, the danger posed by that missing key is very real." Chapter 5. The Whispering Tapestry. The wind keened over the rooftops of Edinburgh as we stepped into the subdued hush of McLaren House once more. Holmes, as ever, strode ahead with purpose, his long coat flaring behind him. I could not help but feel the chill settle deeper into my bones, not from the cold, but from the strange atmosphere clinging to the old house. Something in the very air suggested secrets long buried. Inspector MacLeod met us at the vestibule, his mustache bristling with irritation or perhaps unease. "You'll find that Lady Fiona has taken to her drawing room," he said tersely. "She's unwell still, insists the house is haunted. I'd dismiss it if it weren't for what Mrs. Dalrymple just reported." Holmes turned his head slightly, his eyes catching the inspector's. "Ah? What fresh specter haunts our footsteps now?" "The maid claims she heard weeping in the tapestry gallery just before dawn," MacLeod muttered. "When she went to investigate, the sobbing stopped, but one of the antique swords mounted on the wall had been pulled down. No sign of a break-in." Holmes's mouth twitched into a sardonic smile. "Interesting. The house grieves for its master, perhaps." The inspector snorted, but said nothing. I followed Holmes and MacLeod through a maze of shadowed corridors until we reached the tapestry gallery, so named for the array of medieval and Jacobean wall hangings that stretched along both walls. Here, Holmes paused and removed his gloves, scanning the room with hawk-like attention. The room was lit dimly by 2 narrow windows, their panes warped by time, letting in light that seemed filtered through a dream. "Where was the sword?" Holmes asked, already kneeling beside the darkened patch of floor where something had clearly been replaced. "There," said MacLeod, pointing to an empty bracket on the wall just above head height. "And that's the blade." On a nearby sideboard, polished and slightly curved, lay a broadsword of Scottish origin. Holmes picked it up with care, examining the hilt, the edge, and finally the pommel. "This was not dropped carelessly," he said, voice low. See here, Watson, what do you make of this?" He handed me the sword. Near the pommel I saw what looked like a faint smear rust, perhaps, or something darker. "Blood? It could be recent," I said. Holmes nodded. "Indeed, but not from Sir Alister. There was no mention of swordplay in the circumstances of his demise. So we must ask, why is this blade removed from its resting place, and by whom?" MacLeod frowned. "Do you think the sobbing was a distraction?" Holmes smiled slightly. "No, I believe it was quite real, but its purpose remains concealed. Come, we must speak with Lady Fiona again." We found Lady Fiona reclined on a chaise lounge, wrapped in a heavy shawl of dark blue velvet. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken with sleeplessness. Yet there was a resolute fire behind them, a steeliness born not of weakness, but of something deeper fear that had sharpened into quiet. Determination. "Mr. Holmes," she said softly, her voice trembling, "you return with questions, I suppose, but I fear I have few answers." Holmes bowed slightly. "And yet you may possess more insight than you imagine. I have only a few inquiries." She gestured weakly, then asked, "Have you ever known your late husband to venture into the tapestry gallery at night?" Lady Fiona's eyes darted toward the fireplace, her knuckles whitening. "He detested that room," said it reminded him of history best forgotten. "I never understood." "Interesting," Holmes murmured. "And the tapestry at the gallery's center, the one depicting a hunt, do you know its origin?" She hesitated. "It came with the house, as did most of the pieces. Sir Alister believed it was from the Jacobite period." Holmes's brows lifted faintly. "And yet it does not match the others in age or style." "I believe, Lady Fiona, that your husband feared what that tapestry concealed, not what it portrayed." Her mouth parted slightly. "What do you mean?" Holmes turned toward MacLeod. "I'll need a ladder, a lantern, and a pair of forceps." MacLeod blinked. "You believe the tapestry hides something?" "I believe," Holmes said calmly, "that it speaks. We need only to listen carefully enough." Later that afternoon, with MacLeod and I holding the ladder steady, Holmes ascended to the central tapestry, an enormous woven scene of a stag hunt, with noblemen and hounds rendered in dramatic color. Holmes ran his hand along the edge of the frame, then drew out a pocket lens. "There," he murmured, indicating the lower right corner. "Notice the slight puckering, Watson. Do you see it?" I climbed halfway up the ladder and leaned in. There, hidden within the folds of the seam, was what looked like a stitched-over seam, recent in comparison to the rest. Holmes took out a slender blade and carefully cut through the seam. Behind it, embedded in a hollowed-out recess in the wooden wall, was a small metal box. He descended with it and placed it on a side table. Lady Fiona clutched the edge of her seat, her breath audible. Holmes opened it slowly. Inside lay a set of brittle letters, tied with faded green ribbon, and a small daguerreotype photograph, a man in military uniform smiling faintly. Lady Fiona gasped. That's not my husband." Holmes nodded. "No, but I believe it was someone your husband knew intimately. Someone whose memory haunted him." He handed the photograph to MacLeod. "You'll want to compare this to any old military records. Judging from the buttons and insignia, he was with the Highland Light Infantry." "And the letters?" I asked, leaning closer. Holmes untied the ribbon with reverent precision. He read only a few lines before snapping the topmost shut. "Watson," he said gravely, "these are love letters from a man to another man, written decades ago, and signed Alistair." There was a heavy silence. Lady Fiona's hand trembled as she took the top letter. "He never told me," she whispered. "I thought he was cold, but he was only afraid." Holmes turned to MacLeod. "Inspector, I would wager someone in this house discovered these letters recently. Perhaps used them as blackmail. That, I believe, is what drove Sir Alistair to such a tortured state." MacLeod rubbed his chin. "And the sword?" "A message," Holmes said grimly. "A warning. Perhaps to whomever possessed the letters first, or to the one who used them. Cruelly, we must now discover who had access to this room, and motive to drive a man to his death." He turned toward the window, eyes narrowed as the clouds outside coiled and split like ghosts. "The enigma deepens, Watson, and its roots lie not in the rational, but in the shadows of love, fear, and revenge." Chapter: A Most Curious. Interlude. The steady rumble of the Edinburgh train beneath our feet seemed to echo the churn of thoughts in my mind. Though the highlands had long disappeared behind us, the chill air lingered in my bones, sharpened, no doubt, by the sinister implication of Lady Dunbrake's whispered confession the night before. Holmes, as ever, appeared unaffected by the cold, or by the weight of the mystery. Reclined in his seat, fingers steepled and eyes closed, he could have been napping, were it not for the occasional twitch of a brow or the faint tightening of his lips. To the casual observer, he was at peace. I knew better. I took to reviewing my notes, as I had developed a habit of doing during such intervals of stillness. Yet even as I read over the list of suspects, the evasive footman Gareth, the odd-eyed Reverend Yuan, the belligerent cousin, Mr. Archibald Kerr, and Lady Dunbrake herself, I could not help but feel the ground shifting beneath the facts. Matter of the locked chamber, the whispering in the night, and now this cryptic mention of the man in the mirror and her cursed inheritance. It all floated beyond my grasp like a phantom in the fog dot at length. Holmes stirred. "You did well, Watson, not to press Lady Dunbrake further last night." "I feared if I asked more, she might shut down entirely," I replied. "But her mention of the mirror intrigued me." "You think it connected to the late Lord Dunbrake's death?" Holmes opened his eyes and gave me a sidelong glance. "Most certainly. The question is how and why now." He straightened. "Did you notice the painting above the fireplace in the blue parlor? The one of the stag hunt?" "Yes." "Did you observe how freshly it had been rehung?" I blinked. "No, I confess I did not." "Then allow me to fill in the blanks." The plaster beneath bore fragments of a previous frame one of oval shape, consistent with that of a large wall mirror. Why remove it? And why now? Lady Dunbrake's agitation suggests something far more immediate than an old family superstition. Before I could respond, the train began its slow descent into Waverley Station, the smoke of industry and the spires of Old Town greeting us like brooding sentinels. Our arrival in Edinburgh was timely. Holmes had insisted that certain threads of the case might only be untangled here in the capital, far from the Highland estate and its haunted corridors dot by. Late morning we were striding briskly down Princess Street. A gray mist clung to the buildings, softening the stone with a ghostly pallor. Holmes had directed us toward the offices of McLintock and Fraser, a firm of solicitors who had long served the Dunbrake family. trust legal documents to reveal what human lips will not, Holmes murmured as we approached the narrow door bearing. The firm's name Dot. We were admitted by a nervous clerk who scurried off to fetch Mr. Fraser, a pale and pinched man with spectacles and an air of constant suspicion. He greeted Holmes with a perfunctory nod, but brightened upon hearing the name Dunbrake. "I presume you wish to consult the terms of Lord Dunbrake's will," he said, already turning toward a locked cabinet. "That, and any documents pertaining to entailed property or codicils introduced in the last year," Holmes replied. "Specifically anything amended following the Lord's trip to Florence last summer." Fraser's eyebrows twitched. "You are well informed." "I make it my business to be," said Holmes simply. It took a quarter of an hour, but we were at last seated with a sheaf of legal parchment before us. Holmes read swiftly, occasionally murmuring his approval or narrowing his eyes. I struggled to follow the dense legal phrasing, but caught several key phrases: conditional inheritance, stipulations of mental soundness, and exclusion in the event of disreputable conduct. Holmes tapped the final clause. "Here, Watson, note this. In the event of the heir Lady Dunbrake being declared unfit by reason of madness or criminal association, the estate is to pass to a secondary heir. And who do you think that is?" He turned the page, revealing a familiar name. "Archibald Kerr?" I exclaimed. "Her late husband's cousin?" "Indeed. A man of modest means and loose temperament, who would stand to benefit richly should Lady Dunbrake be discredited." "Good Lord," I muttered. "That puts his hostility in an entirely new light, and perhaps gives us motive enough to probe deeper into this whispering madness that has begun to taint her character." Holmes said, "We must return to Dunbrake Hall without delay, but not before one final stop." Our next visit took us into the twisting closes behind the Royal Mile, where a modest gallery bore the name Mercer and Field's Antique Mirrors and Curios. It was not a place that would have attracted the casual customer, and yet Holmes approached. With purpose inside, the gallery was dim and crowded with ornate frames, aged glass, and the musty perfume of time. A small, French-accented man emerged from behind a curtain and greeted us. "You seek a looking-glass, monsieur?" "In a sense," Holmes replied. "I believe you recently acquired a large oval mirror from the Dunbrake estate gilded frame, slight foxing at the edges, engraved initials E.D. at the back?" The man brightened. "Ah, we from the Highlands, yes. A curious piece, most curious. It came just 2 weeks ago. Would you like to see it?" He led us into a rear chamber where the mirror leaned against the wall, even in the dimness. Its surface glimmered strangely. The glass was popped slightly with age, but what struck me most was the eerie way it seemed to absorb the surrounding shadows. When I caught my own reflection, I started. It was as if something in the depth of the glass moved independently. "Does it not unsettle?" I said quietly. Holmes examined it closely, pulling out a magnifying glass and inspecting the frames, corners. Then, to my surprise, he reached into his coat, withdrew a silk handkerchief, and began tapping at the glass. A soft clink. Then another. He paused, listening, then tapped the right edge again. This time a hollow ring responded. "False panel," he muttered. "There's something concealed within." Before the gallery owner could protest, Holmes had produced a penknife and pried gently at the frame. With a soft pop, a narrow section of the back slid free, revealing a hollow compartment. Inside it lay a slim envelope, brittle with age, sealed in wax with the Dunbrake crest. Holmes opened it carefully and read. His brows lifted. He passed it to me that the letter within was penned in a delicate feminine hand. To whoever finds this letter, I can no longer remain silent. The mirror bears witness to what none must know. What we did in Florence cannot remain buried. If this letter is found, it means someone has tampered with the past. For their sake and mine, let the truth die with this house. E. Dunbrake. What we did in Florence, I repeated slowly. You don't suppose ... I do, said Holmes. And now we must make haste. The game is no longer about whispers in the night. It is about a buried truth, a secret so profound it threatened the very structure of inheritance and identity. By that evening we were again en route to Dunbrake Hall, the landscape rolling past in dusky silhouette. Holmes was deep in thought, the letter still clutched in his gloved hand. Tell me, Holmes, I asked quietly, do you believe Lady Dunbrake is mad? He turned to me, eyes flashing. No, Watson, but I believe someone very much wants the world to think so. And if we do not act quickly, they may succeed. The train roared on into the Highland night. Chapter 7. The Madness at Dunbrake Hall. The train's whistle pierced the dusk as we pulled into the solitary station nearest Dunbrake Hall. A pale moon hung over the distant hills, casting a silver veil over the moors. The wind had turned biting, and the lamps on the platform flickered against the encroaching fog like tiny sentinels, guarding against the unseen. A carriage was waiting for us, an austere black affair driven by the ever-stoic Macready, the estate's chief groundsman. He offered Holmes a nod, but did not speak. I sensed a tension in the air that hadn't been present during our previous arrival. Even the horses seemed restless, shifting and stamping nervously. Holmes said little on the ride back, save to ask a single question. Has anyone left or arrived since we departed? Macready considered before answering. No visitors, sir. Though the Reverend did come up from the vicarage this afternoon, stayed for an hour or so, left just before dusk. Holmes nodded slightly, but I saw the flicker in his eyes. And Lady Dunbrake? Not seen much since morning, sir. Kept to her chambers. Mrs. Graham said she's been most unlike herself. As we passed through the gateposts of Dunbrake Hall, I felt the weight of the place anew. The windows, like unblinking, eyes watched our approach. One on the upper floor, the ladies' chambers, was lit, its glow dimmed by heavy curtains drawn tight. Inside, the hall was quiet. The air was tinged with lavender and something darker old wood, candle smoke, and perhaps even the faintest trace of mildew. Mrs. Graham, the housekeeper, greeted us with her usual stern efficiency, though her lips were thinner than before. She's not well. Gentlemen, she murmured, ushering us into the drawing room. Won't see the doctor. Keeps talking to the empty room, whispering things to herself. It's not natural. She is not mad, Holmes said sharply, and the finality in his voice silenced further protest. We requested an audience, and after a pause, were granted permission to ascend. Lady Dunbrake stood before the fireplace in her private sitting room, still clad in mourning black, her veil now lifted and her eyes bloodshot with fatigue. The flames lit her pallid cheeks, and for a moment I thought she looked years older than she had during our first encounter. "You returned," she said simply. "Then you know." "We know some of it," Holmes replied, though questions remain. "What happened in Florence, Lady Dunbrake?" She said nothing. Instead, her gaze drifted to the far wall, where the stag-hunting painting still hung. I followed her eyes and imagined the oval mirror that had once hung there. What had she seen in that mirror, night after night? "You removed the mirror," Holmes continued gently, "and had it sent away. Why?" Her hands twisted together tightly. "Because I feared what it might show next." Holmes stepped closer. "Or what it might reveal to those determined to use your past against you." Lady Dunbrake flinched as though struck. "It was never meant to come to this," she whispered. "But after Florence, after what I saw in that room, I could not bear the weight of the reflection." And Archibald, he saw how the whispers began. He encouraged them. "You mean to say he deliberately spread rumors of your instability?" "I cannot prove it," she said bitterly, "but I know. I know the servants began to look at me differently. I'd find things moved, small things, but always in my rooms. Letters vanished. Doors that had been locked stood ajar. Once I heard my own voice speaking from behind the mirror." Holmes looked at her sharply. "Your voice? It was a recording," she murmured. "I do not know how, only that it recited words I had once said in Florence. A terrible argument with my Husband. I scarcely remember it clearly, but to hear it echoing back at me, disembodied, was it any wonder I thought I was going mad?" Holmes turned to me, his expression grim. "We are dealing with a calculated campaign of psychological manipulation. Someone has gone to great lengths to isolate and discredit Lady Dunbrake. And the goal is clear," I said, "to paint her as unfit, so that the estate passes to Archibald Kerr." Holmes nodded. "I fear the final act of that campaign is fast approaching," he said. "We must act now." The following morning dawned gray and oppressive. The house seemed suspended in uneasy silence, as though holding its breath. Holmes had risen early and vanished into the lower halls with Macready, inspecting the back corridors and unused servant stairwells. When he returned mid-morning, his boots were muddy and his eyes bright. "We must provoke our adversary, Watson," he said. "Force their hand." "To what end?" "To catch them mid-performance." The stage for Holmes's gambit was set that very evening. Holmes requested a formal dinner for all remaining members of the household. It was an unusual request, but one that Lady Dunbrake agreed to, albeit with some hesitation. A table was laid. In the old dining hall, the great chandelier lit and the heavy curtains drawn. Even Gareth, the elusive footman, reappeared in starched livery, his mismatched eyes flickering with nervous energy. Reverend Ewan sat at the far end of the table, hands folded tightly in his lap, while Mr. Archibald Kerr arrived late, smelling faintly of brandy and looking altogether too pleased with himself. "You know, Holmes," he said with mock conviviality, "I had my doubts about your return. I half expected you'd gone to Florence to chase ghost stories." "Ghosts are often rooted in reality, Mr. Kerr," Holmes replied coolly. The meal passed with false cheer. I noted how Archibald kept glancing at Lady Dunbrake with a curious intensity, watching her wine-glass, her expression, even the way she cut her meat. He was waiting, For what, I could not yet guess, Dot. It was near the final course when Holmes made his move. "I believe there is something everyone here should hear," he said, rising. "A letter. One found in a most unlikely place." He drew from his coat the envelope we had retrieved from the hidden mirror compartment and began to read aloud its contents. The effect was electric. Archibald Kerr's fork froze halfway to his mouth. The Reverend turned pale. Lady Dunbrake stared as if hearing the words afresh. But most telling of all was Gareth the footman, who took an unconscious step backward, as if physically struck. Holmes lowered the letter slowly. "What we did in Florence cannot remain buried," he repeated. "I believe we are closer than ever to understanding just what that means, and who among us fears its revelation most." Kerr laughed suddenly, a brittle, too loud laugh. "Oh, come now," he said. "You'll believe the ramblings of a haunted woman scribbled in some cracked looking-glass? Honestly, Holmes, you disappoint me." Holmes stepped forward. "The mirror, Mr. Kerr, was merely the hiding place. The contents of this letter are no hallucination. And more than that, I now know how the whispers began, and who created them." He turned suddenly toward Gareth. "Shall I tell them about the gramophone, Gareth? The one hidden behind the old linen cupboard on the second floor? The one connected by a hollow panel to Lady Dunbrake's bedchamber wall?" The footman's lips parted in mute astonishment. Then, with a gasp, he bolted for the door. But Holmes was ready. He stepped aside as Macready emerged from the shadows of the hallway, rifle in hand. Gareth skidded to a halt, cornered, and crumpled into a chair. I didn't mean to hurt anyone," he stammered. "He paid me, said it was just a joke, a way to nudge her out, make her go stay with relatives. I didn't know about the will, I swear. Did he ask you to record her voice?" Holmes pressed. Gareth nodded. "Told me to use the phonograph cylinder from that Florence trip. Said she wouldn't remember it, not clearly." Archibald stood, now too, red-faced and blustering. "You can't prove any of this. It's all circumstantial. There's no law against making someone think they're mad." Holmes stepped forward. "There is, Mr. Kerr, when that deception is part of a scheme to defraud an inheritance. And I suspect the Italian authorities would be very interested in revisiting what happened during Lord Dunbrake's untimely accident in Florence." The room fell into stunned silence. Lady Dunbrake, hands trembling, looked not triumphant, but shattered. Holmes turned to her, voice softening. "The mirror saw it all, my lady, but the mirror is not the judge. You are still mistress of this house and of your truth." She closed her eyes, and for the first time in days seemed at peace. Holmes bowed slightly. "I believe, Watson," he murmured, "that justice at last has found its reflection." Chapter 8. Echoes through glass dawn broke sullenly over Dunbrake Hall, casting no cheer upon its door facade. The mists clung to the glens like a mourning shroud, and a thin drizzle threaded down the tall windows like tears, unwilling to fall. Yet within, activity stirred with growing urgency. Holmes had risen early, though he had slept but a few hours. I found him in the morning room, a cold tea untouched by his elbow, his long fingers riffling through the recently returned envelope that once lay hidden within the Dunbrake mirror. He was not reading the letter, no. He had memorized its contents, but rather studying the wax seal and the envelope itself as though it might confess more than the message it bore. "Note the paper quality," he murmured as I entered. not. Local, Italian, handmade, likely Florentine. The same could be said of the sealing wax. Do you see the difference in shade? I squinted. The outer wax is darker, almost dried blood. The interior line where it cracked is paler, precisely. The envelope was resealed at some point. Whoever placed it within the mirror either read it beforehand or added to it after it was originally written. We may be dealing with an incomplete truth or a manipulated one. And what of the hand? I asked. Dunbrake, surely that must be Lady Evelyn? Holmes nodded absently, but then looked toward the corridor with narrowed eyes. That is precisely the conclusion someone wants us to reach. But Evelyn was only in Florence briefly, according to the travel receipts I located. The letter implies knowledge of a secret far older. Just then a knock came at the door. Mrs. Little, the housekeeper, entered with subdued urgency. Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, there's a matter downstairs. A matter? It's Miss Emmeline, sir. She's been found in the East Conservatory, unconscious, and there's blood on the floor. Holmes sprang up instantly. I followed close behind as we strode swiftly through the corridors, our footsteps ringing against stone. The East Conservatory was seldom used, overgrown, and faintly musty. Its glass panes, misted with condensation. Miss Emmeline lay collapsed near the fountain, her shawl half soaked, and her head resting on a pillow hastily gathered from a window seat. A smear of blood marked her temple. Holmes knelt beside her at once, examining the wound with clinical precision. She's breathing. Pulse rapid but steady. A blunt impact likely from a fall, not a weapon. As he turned her head slightly, a silver object tumbled from beneath her hand. I stooped to retrieve it, a compact silver locket. The clasp snapped, its face scratched as though by haste or violence. Holmes took it and opened it delicately. Inside was a miniature portrait, watercolor, finely done, of a man in late middle age, with wavy black hair and eyes the color of smoke. The opposite half held a lock of hair, coiled tightly behind glass. Do you recognize the man? I asked. Holmes studied the portrait in silence. No, but I intend to find out, and soon. At that moment, Emmeline stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, and she gave a small moan. I crouched down beside her and gently took her hand. You're safe now, Miss Emmeline. Just breathe slowly. You've had a fall. Her lips moved faintly, then parted. The mirror, she whispered. It showed him again. I saw him. He was there. Who, Miss Emmeline? I asked, but her head turned away, her eyes closing once more. Whether from fatigue or fear, she lapsed back into silence. Holmes rose slowly, slipping the locket into his coat. His gaze was cold and sharp. Someone brought her here, he said. She would never have entered this chamber alone in the middle of the night. Note the broken fern pot by the threshold, the partially cleared trail in the condensation on the panes. She was guided or pursued. She mentioned the mirror, I said. Do you believe she's hallucinating? No, he replied. She saw something. But whether what she saw was real or contrived is the question. We left Emmeline under the care of Mrs. Little and made our way back to the drawing room, where Lady Dunbrake awaited us. She stood by the hearth, fingers trembling against the mantel. A decanter of sherry sat untouched nearby. She is my niece, she said flatly. I know her ways. she wouldn't faint from nothing. "You're right to be alarmed," Holmes said, "but also to be vigilant. May I ask, have you ever seen this man before?" He held out the locket. Lady Dunbrake took it, and her face changed almost immediately, first with recognition, then with horror. She dropped the locket as though it had burned her fingers. "Where did you find this?" Clutched in Emmeline's hand, her voice dropped to a whisper. "That man was Erasmo de Bianchi, an artist, a Florentine. He painted my portrait when I was a girl." "Did your late husband know him?" She hesitated. "Yes, too well. We encountered him during our travels. I never liked him. He was charming, but watchful. And what became of him?" Her mouth opened, then closed. "He died. Years ago." "In Florence?" "Yes." Then, more softly, "It was called a fall, an accident." Holmes gave no reply at first. He only nodded and retrieved the locket once more. "Thank you, Lady Dunbrake. I believe your answers have helped more than you realize." We left her standing stiffly by the fire, her gaze lost in a world we could not see. Once in the corridor, Holmes turned to me. "Now we know what the mirror concealed. A link not only to Florence, but to a death, perhaps even a murder, that could undermine the entire legacy of this house." Evelyn Dunbrake's letter was not a confession. It was a warning. A warning. To whom? To the heir. To whoever would claim Dunbrake Hall. And it's becoming increasingly clear that someone is trying to suppress that warning by any means necessary. As we walked back toward Holmes's study, we passed the footman Gareth emerging from a shadowed passage. He bowed quickly, eyes low. Holmes regarded him carefully, then waited until he was out of earshot. "He knows something," Holmes murmured. "And not merely about tonight. Do you intend to confront him?" "In due course. But for now, Watson, I need your assistance with a small experiment." "An experiment?" Holmes's eyes twinkled grimly. "We are going to rehang the mirror." That evening, as dusk bled into the hallways of Dunbrake, we stood in the blue parlor once more. The portrait of the stag hunt had been removed, revealing the faint outline of where the original mirror had hung. Holmes and I, with the aid of a ladder and Holmes's precise instructions, mounted the oval glass in its former place. "There," he said at last, stepping back. "Now we wait." "For what?" "For the guilty to return and attempt to erase what has been restored." The stage, it seemed, had been reset. Now we would see which ghost walked through the reflection first. Chapter 9. Reflections after midnight. Dunbrake Hall slumbered uneasily beneath a moon veiled in drifting mist. The ancient stones seemed to absorb more shadow than they cast, and the trees outside stirred like whispering sentinels in the wind. Inside, the halls were silent, save for the muted creaks and groans of a house steeped in secrets. Holmes and I had taken our places in the blue parlor, the mirror newly restored to its original place above the marble fireplace. A single oil lamp cast its flickering glow, the flame mirrored in the glass like a ghost light in a theater of shadows. The air was heavy with expectancy. Holmes sat in the armchair opposite the mirror, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "We must be still." "Watson," he said quietly, "the guilty believe the past has been buried. Let us see if they come tonight to rebury it." I nodded, though a part of me was uneasy. The house had taken on a strange atmosphere in the hours since we reinstalled the mirror, tense, watchful. as though the very walls were aware of the trap. Holmes had set Dot by silent agreement. We kept the lamp dimmed, the curtains drawn. Midnight crept upon us like a thief. The fire had burned down to coals, and the wind rattled faintly against the window panes. Then, just past the hour, we heard the softest sound Dot footsteps, Dot light. Measured, deliberate. They paused outside the blue parlor door. Holmes motioned for silence. We remained motionless as a shadow broke the thin line of lamplight beneath the door. The knob turned with painstaking slowness, and the door opened a fraction, then more. A figure entered, robed in a dark cloak, the face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Their steps were cautious yet assured as they moved directly to the hearth and stood before the mirror. Holmes watched with the intensity of a predator. I dared not move. The intruder removed a bundle from within the cloak, a small velvet pouch. From it, they withdrew a thin blade. Not a dagger, but a painter's knife, narrow, curved. They raised it and pressed its edge into the seam between mirror and wall, probing gently Dot. Just then, Holmes stood. "That will do," he said with calm authority. The figure whirled. A gloved hand darted toward their belt, a concealed pocket, but Holmes was faster. In 2 strides he was upon them, seizing their wrist and yanking away the blade. "Lights, Watson!" I sprang to the lamp and turned it up fully, flooding the room with warm light. Before us stood Gareth, the young footman, his face pale but defiant. "Let me go," he hissed, struggling in Holmes's iron grip. "You've no right." "I have every right," Holmes said coldly. "You've just attempted to tamper with evidence in a criminal investigation. I wasn't going to destroy it, I just—" Gareth stopped, jaw clenched. "You just intended to extract something," Holmes said. "A second letter? A confession? Or perhaps something worth far more than either a forged will?" Gareth's silence was answer enough. I stepped closer, noting his trembling shoulders, the sweat on his brow. "Why now?" I asked. "Why return tonight?" He looked between us, his defiance fading to weariness. "Because I couldn't let it come out. Not the way it's going." "You're not acting alone," Holmes said. "Tell us the truth. Who are you protecting?" Gareth sat heavily in the armchair, head bowed. "It's not what you think." "Then enlighten us." He drew a slow breath. "My real name isn't Gareth, it's Gareth Bianchi." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Italian. My mother was," he said. "Florentine. Her father was Erasmo de Bianchi." The room fell silent. "The artist?" I said. "The one in the locket?" "Yes. He was my grandfather. He had a child with a housemaid after Lady Dunbrake sat for him. She was dismissed, disgraced. My grandfather tried to marry her, but her employers intervened. A scandal. He lost commissions. They fled together, but the Dunbrakes ensured no door opened for him again. He fell from a rooftop studio 6 months later. They called it an accident. And you were raised with this story," Holmes said. "My mother never let it go. She believed the Dunbrakes ruined him, ruined us, but she died before she could do anything. I came here under a false name. I needed to learn the truth." "Who helped you?" Holmes asked. "I worked alone," he said quickly. Holmes's gaze was hard. "You're lying." The resealed letter, the hidden compartments, the restored mirror, this was not the work of an untrained youth. Someone in this house has aided you. Before Gareth could answer, the door to the parlor opened again. It was Miss Emmeline. She stood in her dressing gown, pale as ivory, but her eyes clear and burning with something fierce. "I helped him," she said quietly. "Emmeline, no." Gareth stood abruptly. "You don't need to protect me." "I'm not protecting you," she said. "I'm telling the truth. I discovered the mirror's secret a year ago. I found the compartment, but I was afraid. I only told Gareth because I trusted him. We thought foolishly that if we could find proof, we might clear his grandfather's name." Holmes studied them both. "So you hope to find documents implicating Lord Dunbrake?" "Yes," Emmeline said. "We thought he might have forced Evelyn to abandon the child or paid off the mother. But instead we found the letter and the locket. Gareth was going to return them to the mirror tonight to protect me, in case someone found out." "Why pretend to be unconscious?" I asked her. She flushed. "I wasn't pretending. Someone pushed me. I didn't see who." Holmes turned sharply. "Someone knew you were searching." She nodded. "Yes. I'd been in the conservatory, looking through old trunks for anything about Evelyn. The next thing I knew, I was on the ground." Holmes stepped forward, taking in both their expressions. "There's one truth you both have missed. Evelyn didn't hide your grandfather's memory. She tried to preserve it. That letter was never a confession. It was a protection, a message to her child, perhaps even a clue to a rightful inheritance." Gareth blinked. "What do you mean?" Holmes turned to the mirror. "I believe there's more yet concealed, and we are no longer the only ones looking for it." A sound in the hall, soft, almost imperceptible, brought all our heads up. Then the glass in the mirror trembled, not with wind, not with footsteps, with purpose, as though something behind it was stirring. Holmes reached forward and gently tapped along the edge again, then stopped. "A false back," he said. "There's something more behind this." We watched breathlessly as he took the painter's knife Gareth had brought and carefully wedged it behind the panel. With a delicate push, the back gave way with a quiet click. Inside lay a thin portfolio, wrapped in faded velvet. Holmes drew it out slowly, and there, tied in a ribbon of crimson silk, was a second envelope, this one addressed not to my beloved, but to true heir of Dunbrake. Chapter 10. The letter of bloodlines, the envelope in Holmes's hand, felt heavier than paper and ink ought to be, as though the weight of decades, of silenced truths and unacknowledged lineage, had been sealed within its crimson ribbon. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he regarded it with a reverence bordering on solemnity. Emmeline and Gareth stood near the hearth, pale and breathless, their expressions taut with anticipation. I could feel the same tension in my own chest as I stood at Holmes's side. "It may change everything," I whispered. Holmes nodded, eyes fixed on the label. "To the true heir of Dunbrake." With a swift yet precise motion, he untied the ribbon and unfolded the paper. His eyes moved rapidly across the page, his brow furrowing not in confusion, but in comprehension, as though the last piece of a long, elusive pattern had just fallen into place. He handed the letter to me. It was written in a fine, elegant hand, Evelyn. Dunbrake's unmistakably. "If this finds its way to you, then you have uncovered what was never meant to remain hidden. I loved him, Erasmo, with all the fire of youth and defiance. They called it folly. They said I had shamed the family. They, sent him away and me to Switzerland under the guise of recovery. I bore a son in secret. They named him an orphan and placed him far from here with money to ensure silence and distance. They called it mercy. My father, Lord Dunbrake, could not abide the idea of his line being tainted by foreign blood and an artist's brush. But I knew better. I watched my son grow through stolen glimpses and secret letters sent through intermediaries, until those too were taken from me. If you are reading this, then you are that child's child, my grandson, and you deserve to know that your blood is as noble as any that walks these halls more so, for it carries truth, not pretense. The locket is yours, and so is what lies beneath this mirror. Use it to reclaim what is yours, or let it burn if you would rather be free of it. It was signed with a flourish that trembled at the end. Evelyn Dunbrake. The silence in the blue parlor stretched long after I finished reading. Gareth stared at the letter in my hands as though it were an apparition. Emmeline's eyes brimmed with tears. Holmes, as ever, was composed. Now we understand, he said softly. Not only a letter, but a confession of lineage. A noble woman, disinherited for love, a son cast into obscurity, and a grandson returned to the scene of the crime, not to claim vengeance, but truth. Gareth swallowed hard. Then it's true. She was my grandmother, and I are of the Dunbrake blood, Holmes said, whether the current Lord Dunbrake acknowledges it or not. A heavy knock at the parlor door broke the moment. It was Inspector Craydon, lantern in hand, his expression grave. Holmes, you'd best come with me. There's been another development. We followed him into the hall and through the house, to the far east wing, past the servants' quarters, and through a narrow corridor that smelled of old stone and dampness. We emerged into the armory gallery, a seldom-used room where the family's ancestral weapons were displayed behind locked glass cabinets. One of those cabinets now stood open. On the floor beneath it, Lord Bertram Dunbrake, dead. His body lay slumped against the wall, one hand clutching at his waistcoat, the other stretched limply toward a ceremonial saber still sheathed beside him. His face bore no visible wound, only a strange, still expression, as though death had stolen upon him without struggle. "Doctor?" Craydon said, motioning to me. I crouched beside the body, checking his pulse. Gone. Less than an hour. Perhaps much less. Holmes knelt and studied the area around the corpse. No blood, he said. No sign of a struggle. And yet he leaned closer, examining Lord Dunbrake's lips and the faint discoloration of his fingertips. Poison, I would wager. Suicide? Craydon muttered. Possibly, Holmes said, though not necessarily voluntary. The inspector looked toward the open cabinet. That display hasn't been touched in decades. Yet something was taken and quickly returned. Holmes rose, brushing dust from his knees. A theatrical setting, Inspector. If this was meant to appear symbolic, it may be a final gesture or a smokescreen. I glanced down at the saber. Then the weapon wasn't used? No, but its absence suggests intent. And consider the timing, barely an hour after the letter was found. Holmes turned to Gareth. Your presence here may have been more threatening than you realized. But I never spoke to him, Gareth said. Not once. He avoided me. Perhaps he recognized you without admitting it, Emmeline said, or knew who you were the moment you entered the hall. Holmes nodded. and feared what else you might uncover. Inspector Creighton crossed his arms. Then this letter does it. Change the matter of inheritance? In-law? Holmes said. Not unless the family acknowledges it. But in truth, it changes everything. He stepped away from the body and motioned for us to follow him back toward the parlor. There he paced slowly before the fire, fingers pressed together beneath his chin. There is one final question, he said at last, that haunts me still. If Lord Dunbrake feared this truth emerging feared Gareth, then why wait? Why not act sooner? You think he meant to kill me? Gareth asked, aghast. Holmes shook his head. No, I think someone else did. Or someone ensured he took his own life to avoid disgrace. Which means, my dear Watson, that we are closer to the murderer than ever. You believe the deaths are connected? I asked. Evelyn's. Now Bertram's? Yes, Holmes said. And there is more yet concealed in this house. A second-hand someone who knew of Evelyn's letter before even Gareth found it. Emmeline paled. You mean someone else read the letter? Emmeline paled. You mean someone else read the letter? Yes, someone who tried to erase it once before. They failed. And now he turned to the mirror. They may try again. Gareth moved closer. What do we do now? Holmes glanced at the clock. We prepare. For tonight, the game shifts once again. The heir has been named, the secret unsealed. But truth is a torch, and someone in this house fears the fire. Chapter 11 whispers beneath the ancestral stone. The air within Dunbrake Hall was thick with apprehension. Word of Lord Bertram's. Death had already begun to seep through the old corridors like fog through a broken window pane. Though Creighton had instructed the servants to remain discreet, the hall itself seemed to murmur with the knowledge. Even the ancestral portraits appeared altered in expression, frowning, watching, judging. Holmes sat before the fire in the blue parlor, fingertips pressed together beneath his chin, gazing at the mirror above the mantelpiece, as if it might speak again. Beside him sat Gareth, the newly revealed heir by blood, his face still pale but now tinged with a strange calm, like a man who had passed through storm and found himself on unfamiliar but solid ground. Emmeline poured tea in silence. No. Her hand trembled slightly as she handed me my cup. I accepted it with a nod of thanks. What will become of him now? She asked Holmes quietly. Gareth. That depends, Holmes said, not shifting his gaze, on whether the truth is allowed to live, or whether the past will devour it as it has done twice already. You think Lord Bertram's death wasn't suicide, I said. You think someone helped it along. Holmes finally turned his head toward me. I do. But the poison surely that points to a deliberate act. If Bertram feared Gareth's presence, feared exposure, might he not have taken his own life rather than face disgrace? Possible, yes, Holmes admitted. But unlikely. Bertram Dunbrake was a proud man. Pride has many faces. Watson guilt is seldom one of them. He rose, walked to the mirror once more, and examined its frame. The hidden latch had already been revealed during the discovery of Evelyn's letter, but now Holmes pressed further, sliding his fingers along the upper edge, tapping lightly. A hidden letter, a noble secret, and now a corpse. This hall is far too silent for such noise. Suddenly, with a faint metallic click, part of the mantel gave way. A second compartment, Holmes muttered. Within was a flat, rectangular box wrapped in a velvet cloth. He removed it gently and unwrapped it, revealing an ornate key golden, with an elaborate hilt resembling a raven's wing. Holmes turned it in his gloved hand. "This," he said, "is not meant for any ordinary lock." Emmeline stepped closer. "That shape, it looks familiar." Holmes nodded. "As it should. I saw a matching carving yesterday during my brief walk through the Dunbrake family crypt." The room went still. Gareth blinked. "The crypt?" "Indeed," Holmes said. "On the far edge of the estate lies the ancestral tomb, ringed by yew trees. A quiet, neglected place. No servants go there anymore. But there's a plaque within, worn and crumbling, bearing the same crest as this key." "You think the rest of Evelyn's secret is hidden in a crypt?" I asked, astonished. Holmes looked to Gareth. "It's not uncommon for noble families to hide the most shameful secrets alongside the dead. They assume the silence of tombs makes for better confidants than the living." "I'll go with you," Gareth said, rising. Holmes nodded. "I expected as much. But first we must tread carefully. If someone in this hall helped Lord Bertram into his grave, they may not be pleased to see us trespass further into the past." Craydon, summoned at Holmes's request, arrived shortly after, stomping the mud from his boots as he entered the parlor. "The place is sealed now," he said. "No one leaves or enters Dunbrake Hall without my say." "Good," Holmes said, "because I intend to open something else entirely." The moon was a pale ghost behind the drifting clouds as we descended the slope to the family crypt. The grass was heavy with dew, and the scent of damp stone rose around us like breath from the underworld. The Dunbrake crypt stood beneath an arch of yew branches, the mausoleum carved from dark granite streaked with age. Its door was old iron, rusted and vine-entwined, and at its center, just beneath the family crest, was a peculiar keyhole shaped like a raven in flight. Holmes inserted the key. With a reluctant groan, the lock turned. Inside, the air was heavy, unmoving. Candles from Craydon's lantern cast grotesque shadows along the stone corridor, illuminating plaques and inscriptions dating back over a century. Some names had been eroded by time, others freshly engraved. At the far end was a sealed alcove, with a narrow door made not of iron, but old oak bound with blackened bronze. Above the door, E.D. "Evelyn Dunbrake," Emmeline whispered. Holmes approached and pushed. The door yielded with a sound like ancient breath being exhaled. Inside was not a tomb, but a narrow chamber, a private sanctum carved deep into the hill. There were books, scrolls, dust-laden volumes, and atop a pedestal a small wooden box. Holmes opened it. Inside, a lock of hair, faded letters, and a tiny, faded sketch. A young woman, Evelyn, smiling beside a man with olive skin, sharp cheekbones, and a paintbrush in hand. "Erasmo," Gareth breathed. "This chamber was hers," Holmes said. A memory sealed away not just from the family but from herself. They told her to forget. So she buried remembrance with the dead. Watson turned the letters over. "These ... they're from him." And her replies. "Precisely," Holmes said. "Proof. Undeniable proof. More than a bloodline, here is a history. Do we take them?" I asked. "No," Holmes said. "We copy them. Carefully. The originals must remain hidden until it is safe. For now it is enough that we know where the truth lies. As we began to retreat from the crypt, the wind outside rose sharply, slamming the old oak door shut behind us. Gareth, startled. "Was that?" "No more than the wind," I said, but Holmes turned slowly, lantern held high. "Not the wind," he said grimly. "We are not alone." Footsteps echoed behind us in the crypt corridor. A flicker of movement, cloak, shadow. It disappeared down the passage. Creighton raised his pistol. "Show yourself." Silence, then a voice faint and cold. "You should not have come here." Holmes whispered. "Someone followed us, and they were not meant to find what we found." He exchanged a look with Creighton, then turned back toward Gareth. "We must return to the hall, quickly. There is danger yet to come." And above us, muffled by earth and stone, came the distant toll of the Dunbrake bell. 1, 2, 3 times. A signal, or a warning. Chapter 12. The man in the gallery. We returned to Dunbrake Hall with haste, our lanterns casting nervous flickers over hedgerows and bramble as we ascended from the crypt. The echo of that voice, "You should not have come here," still clung to the air like a fog that would not lift. Even Creighton, who had thus far met every peril with the calm of a seasoned hound, glanced over his shoulder more than once during our return. Inside the hall felt somehow colder. The once steady ticking of the long case clock in the vestibule had stopped. Its pendulum hung motionless, as if time itself had frozen in anticipation. Holmes said nothing as he removed his coat. His eyes darted quickly around the entrance hall, pausing at each archway, each corridor that branched like veins into the vast house. His gaze rested for a moment on the eastern corridor that led toward the gallery. "Watson," he murmured, "check the bell tower. See if any mechanism has been disturbed. Creighton, inspect the perimeter doors. Ensure we remain sealed." "And I?" Gareth asked. Holmes gave him a faint, grim smile. "You, my friend, are the reason this is happening. Best stay within sight." Emmeline, pale and silent, lingered near the stairway, her fingers twisted into the folds of her shawl. I saw her glance upward more than once toward the second floor, where shadows pooled at the edges of the gallery rail like a waiting audience. I ascended the west stair with caution, every creak of the step beneath me a gunshot in that vast silence. When I reached the bell tower door, I found it bolted from within, as it should have been. No signs of tampering, no footprints in the dust. And yet the bell had tolled. Had someone triggered it from below with a length of rope? Or was it merely coincidence, a sway from the night wind? I doubted it. When I returned to the drawing room some 15 minutes later, I found Holmes crouched near the hearth, examining a small cluster of broken glass scattered across the rug. "Wine glass," he said without looking up. "Still damp. Someone was here while we were gone?" "Yes. In fact, not 10 minutes ago." A hurried hand, trembling. Whoever it was drank something possibly to summon courage. He held up the stem of the glass and pointed to a faint pink smear near the base. "Lipstick," he said. "Not Emmeline's shade. Rose gold distinctive." "Lady Violet," I said at once. "Indeed." Gareth, standing by the window, turned sharply. "But she retired hours ago. She said she was unwell." "Unwellness is often a convenient disguise," Holmes said, rising. "But this was no ordinary visit to the drawing room. Someone came here to watch." "Watch whom?" "You," Holmes said, looking to Gareth, and perhaps us. Emmeline stepped forward now, finally breaking her silence. You spoke of danger earlier, she said, her voice taut. But I still don't understand who would wish Gareth harm. Who would care what Evelyn Dunbrake did half a century ago? Holmes's expression softened only slightly. My dear Miss Emmeline, you think this is about old scandal. But no, this is about inheritance. He turned toward the hall and beckoned us all to follow. Holmes led us back toward the grand gallery, a long corridor lined with oil portraits, each bearing the haughty likeness of a Dunbrake ancestor. Torches flickered in their brackets along the walls, and above, a vaulted ceiling gave the impression of a cathedral's hushed dot. At the far end of the gallery was a half-curtained arch, the entrance to a narrow room used to store family records, old journals, ceremonial ledgers, and financial correspondences. Creighton had once referred to it jokingly as the Tomb of Boredom, but now Holmes entered it with a purpose that bordered on reverence. He selected a specific ledger from the top shelf. Its spine cracked as he opened it. 5 years ago, Holmes muttered, there was a shift. What kind of shift? I asked. In the Dunbrake investments, he said. Several major parcels of land transferred quietly to a holding firm. But that firm, he turned the page, was owned by a legal trust, one tied not to Lord Bertram, but to Lady Violet. There was a moment of stunned silence. Gareth blinked. But she had no stake in the family fortune, at least not directly. No acknowledged stake, Holmes corrected. And yet she maneuvered herself into a position of influence, not unlike a spider in the center of a web-tugging ever, so gently. You think she was behind Lord Bertram's death? Emmeline asked. I think, Holmes said, closing the ledger, that we are standing in the remains of a long-laid trap, one that Lord Bertram began and Lady Violet may well have finished. Before we could respond, a sudden creak echoed through the corridor behind us. We spun Dot from the shadows. A figure emerged slowly, silhouetted against the light of the gallery. Lady Violet Dunbrake. She wore a long silk robe, pale blue and finely embroidered. Her hair was loose, cascading around her shoulders. Her expression was not surprised, but composed, calm, almost pitying. How dreadfully rude of me, she said in a voice like chilled water, to interrupt your little séance among the ghosts. Lady Violet, Holmes said smoothly. You move silently for one so accustomed to having others announce her. Her lips curled. You've uncovered Evelyn's little treasure chest, haven't you? The love story in the crypt? I have, Holmes said. It's quite a moving account, but I suspect you didn't follow us to admire the penmanship. She stepped forward, folding her hands in front of her. No, she said. I followed you because I knew once you discovered Gareth's truth, you'd come for me next. And why would that trouble you? I asked. She looked to Gareth, her eyes suddenly sharp. Because, she said, if the world believes that a half-Moorish painter's child should inherit Dunbrake Hall, ... then what am I? No one spoke. Holmes's voice was soft now. You're the last vestige of a dying order, one built on secrets and pride. But time, my lady, cannot be bribed, and truth refuses to rot. For a moment, Lady Violet's composure cracked, her eyes blazed, and she seemed to tremble with something old and bitter. Then she turned on her heel and walked away without another word. Only when her footsteps had vanished entirely did Gareth speak again. "She's not finished," he said quietly. Holmes nodded. "No," he agreed. "But neither are we." He turned to Creighton. "Double the watch on the east wing. Check the estate's wine cellars and medical supplies, and assign someone to watch her room discreetly." "On it," Creighton said, already moving. Holmes took out the folded sketch of Evelyn and Erasmo and looked at it once more. "We have unearthed the heart of this mystery," he said. "Now we must protect it before another grave is filled."